The end of World War II in Europe left behind a vast and varied array of scientific and technological remnants. Among the most intriguing were the secret weapons laboratories, sprawling sites dedicated to the development of the Axis powers' most advanced and often experimental technologies. These laboratories, many shrouded in mystery and located in remote or heavily fortified areas, played crucial roles in the military strategies of Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, and their allies. However, with the surrender of the Axis powers in May 1945, the fate of these institutions shifted dramatically. No longer serving their original purpose, the laboratories found themselves at the heart of post-war occupation and geopolitical realignment, subject to the priorities of the Allies who now had control over the territories that housed them. The immediate aftermath of the war left Europe in a state of both physical and economic collapse. The destruction wrought by the conflict was almost absolute, with entire cities and regions lying in ruins. Industries that had once been engines of war production now stood idle, awaiting decisions on their future. It was within this environment of upheaval and scarcity that the future of the secret weapons laboratories was debated. The sheer scale of the resources tied up in these facilities, combined with the necessity for rebuilding and the overriding need to address the immense human and material costs of the war, created an environment ripe for difficult decisions. Nazi Germany alone had constructed over 1,500 major underground and fortified research and manufacturing sites during the war, with varying degrees of success and functionality. From high-tech missile and rocket laboratories to more obscure projects related to biological and chemical weapons, the research conducted within these walls was on the cutting edge of warfare. Some of the most notable laboratories were located in the mountainous regions of southern Germany, such as the Peenemünde Army Research Center and the infamous underground facilities in the Harz Mountains. Others were scattered across occupied Europe, in places like Austria, Poland, and the Czech Republic. Many of these sites were abandoned or destroyed in the chaos of the final months of the war, but others remained intact, filled with advanced research and materials. As the war ended, the Allies found themselves confronted with a vast trove of scientific data, experimental prototypes, and industrial facilities. The question became what to do with this wealth of potentially dangerous knowledge. For the Allies, the priority was clear: prevent the technology from falling into the hands of their wartime enemies and secure it for their own purposes. This task was complicated by the rapid division of Europe between the Soviet Union and the Western Allies, with each side eager to gain an upper hand in the emerging Cold War. The United States, in particular, was determined to secure any technological advantage it could, particularly in fields like rocket science, nuclear technology, and advanced weaponry. To that end, the U.S. launched Operation Paperclip, a covert program designed to bring German scientists, engineers, and technicians to America to continue their work under the protection of the American government. This initiative, shrouded in secrecy, led to the relocation of thousands of scientists and their families, including some of the leading minds behind the Nazi weapons programs. The most famous example of this was Wernher von Braun, the rocket scientist who had been instrumental in the development of the V-2 rocket. After the war, von Braun and his team were relocated to the United States, where they played a pivotal role in the development of the U.S. space program. Yet not all of the laboratories and technologies were seen as viable or desirable. Many of the more experimental or ethically questionable projects were abandoned outright. These included efforts related to the development of biological and chemical weapons, which had been tested in secret and under brutal conditions. The Allies were not interested in perpetuating these types of research, and many laboratories were either demolished or left to decay in the wake of the war. The secret biological warfare facilities in places like the concentration camp at Dachau, where horrific human experimentation had been conducted, were closed and left behind, abandoned to the ravages of time. Simultaneously, the newly formed Soviet Union sought to exert its influence over the vast swathes of Eastern Europe that had fallen under its control. The Soviet approach was one of aggressive acquisition, particularly in the areas of military technology. Soviet teams were sent into Germany and other former Axis territories to seize laboratories, documents, and equipment. They also began recruiting German scientists and technicians, offering them better living conditions and resources in exchange for their knowledge. This led to the establishment of Soviet research facilities focused on continuing the work that had been done by the Germans, albeit under the direction of Soviet interests. One of the most important laboratories for the Soviets was in the town of Kummersdorf, located south of Berlin. Here, the Soviets seized not only the remaining assets of the German military-industrial complex but also the most promising scientific minds from the Third Reich. It was here that the Soviet Union focused much of its efforts on replicating and advancing the German rocket technology, eventually leading to the development of their own missile programs. Much like the United States, the Soviets were eager to harness the knowledge gained from the secret laboratories to ensure their own dominance in the emerging Cold War. This was a period of intense scientific rivalry, with both superpowers racing to unlock the secrets of the technology and research that had once been at the forefront of the Axis military efforts. In Western Europe, however, the picture was somewhat different. The countries of the Allied coalition faced severe economic hardships in the wake of the war. Reconstruction was a priority, and the amount of resources allocated to scientific research was limited. While the Allied powers were keen to prevent the technologies from falling into enemy hands, there was no immediate urgency to repurpose all of the captured facilities. Instead, many of the laboratories remained dormant for years, often abandoned by the very scientists who had once worked there. In the case of the Peenemünde site, once a bustling center of research for the German military's rocket program, the end of the war left the facility in ruins. Much of the equipment had been dismantled or destroyed, and the remnants were quickly moved to other locations or repurposed for other uses. In the Soviet-controlled zone of Germany, Peenemünde was not a priority, and the facility fell into disrepair. The Western Allies were hesitant to invest too heavily in such sites, as the post-war economic situation demanded a focus on more immediate needs. The site itself became a symbol of the wartime effort, a reminder of the potential power of the technologies developed there, but also a testament to the changing nature of post-war priorities. Across Europe, as the laboratories were either repurposed, abandoned, or destroyed, another fate befell many of the materials and technology that had once been deemed critical to the Axis war effort. Thousands of tons of equipment, documents, and prototypes were abandoned in storage depots or left to rot in the same buildings that had once been their birthplace. The true extent of these lost technologies remains unclear. Much of the research, particularly that related to secret weaponry, was hastily buried, hidden, or even deliberately destroyed by the retreating Nazi forces to prevent its capture. The remnants of these secret weapons laboratories, their abandoned research, and the thousands of tons of documents and materials they left behind, are a reminder of the war's long shadow. As Europe struggled to recover, the true legacy of these laboratories would take decades to fully understand. Some technologies were repurposed, some lost to history, and others, like the work on biological warfare, would haunt the world in ways that were not yet apparent. For all the efforts to harness the knowledge contained in these once formidable sites, the aftermath of the war was marked by a profound uncertainty about what to preserve, what to discard, and what to forget. The immediate post-war years marked a period of shifting priorities, with the once highly classified secret weapons laboratories of the Axis powers now in a state of flux. The grand designs for a new world order, along with the competition between the emerging superpowers, would define the fate of the technologies housed within these now abandoned or repurposed sites. The initial destruction and abandonment of many laboratories were merely the beginning of a more complex and subtle phase of geopolitical maneuvering, technological recovery, and, in some cases, tragic loss. For the United States, the stakes were high. The end of the war did not bring immediate peace or stability. Rather, it sparked a new form of conflict, this time ideological. The Soviet Union, emboldened by its victory over Nazi Germany, sought to expand its influence across Eastern Europe and beyond. It was in this context that the Cold War began, with both the Soviet Union and the United States realizing that the next stage of global dominance would be determined not by armies alone but by the control of advanced technology. The remnants of Nazi Germany's secret weapons programs, including the abandoned laboratories, held the promise of such technology. Thus, the task of salvaging, repurposing, and even redistributing these scientific achievements became paramount for both sides. One of the first major initiatives undertaken by the United States was the systematic recovery of German scientific personnel through Operation Paperclip. This covert program brought over 1,600 scientists, engineers, and technicians to the U.S., many of whom had worked on some of the most ambitious and dangerous projects of the Nazi regime. Among the most famous of these scientists was Wernher von Braun, a rocket scientist whose work on the V-2 rocket during the war would lay the foundation for the U.S. space program. Von Braun, along with a number of his colleagues, was relocated to America, where he continued to develop his expertise in rocket technology. By 1955, von Braun's team had helped launch the first successful American satellite, Explorer 1, ushering in the space age. However, the ethical questions surrounding his past, namely his role in Nazi weapons development and his employment of forced labor in Piedmont, were often overshadowed by the perceived technological triumphs he helped usher in. The U.S. was not alone in securing these scientific minds. The Soviet Union, under its leader Joseph Stalin, was determined to seize as much of the German technological bounty as possible. With a heavy focus on military and rocket science, the Soviets set about taking control of the vast array of laboratories and research sites in their occupied zones. The most significant of these was the Piedmont Army Research Center, the site of Germany's rocket development program, which had produced the V-2 rocket. After the war, the Soviets dismantled much of the research equipment and sent it back to the Soviet Union, where it would form the basis of the Soviet space and missile programs. In addition to the human resources and knowledge the Soviets obtained, they also made use of a staggering amount of physical resources. As in the United States, the Soviets recognized the strategic value of the technology that had been developed under the German military-industrial complex. Laboratories, factories, and manufacturing facilities were stripped of their equipment, while research materials and documents were transported to the Soviet Union. In this sense, the acquisition of these German technologies wasn't just about the recruitment of individual scientists, it was about the vast industrial infrastructure that could be repurposed for the Soviets' own ends. One particularly notable Soviet acquisition was the expertise and knowledge contained within the German military's rocket programs, particularly the V-2 rocket, which had been used during the war to target London and other cities in England. The Soviets were keenly interested in the potential of these technologies, as they saw them as crucial to advancing their own missile programs. At the site in Kummersdorf, south of Berlin, the Soviets quickly began setting up their own research facility, where they replicated the German V-2 technology and began experimenting with their own missile designs. Over the years, Soviet engineers, many of whom had once worked alongside the Germans, would use these foundations to develop the famous R-7 and R-16 rockets, which would eventually become the backbone of the Soviet space and missile programs. The question of what to do with the laboratories and research sites that had become abandoned after the end of the war was not just a military or political one, it was also an economic issue. Across Europe, the economies of war-torn countries were in dire straits, and the immediate priority was rebuilding. However, the presence of these advanced technologies presented an opportunity. The United States, through initiatives like the Marshall Plan, funneled financial aid into Europe in an effort to stabilize the region and prevent the spread of communism. But the financial aid was not without strings attached. Part of the aid went toward the repurposing of some of the Axis-era laboratories for peaceful purposes, including the development of civilian industries and infrastructure. Some of the captured German research sites were turned into civilian research centers, where former Axis scientists were tasked with working on projects unrelated to military technology. In many cases, this transition was not smooth. The profound psychological scars left by the war, particularly the use of forced labor and the brutal conditions in which many of the German scientific teams had worked, complicated efforts to continue research in these areas. In some instances, entire laboratories were abandoned once it became clear that their previous functions could not be easily repurposed for civilian work. For the Allied powers, there was a continued tension between the desire to exploit the captured German technologies and the moral and ethical considerations tied to their origin. Some projects, such as the biological and chemical weapons research that had been carried out by the Nazis, were abandoned entirely. In 1947, the United States and the United Kingdom jointly declared that the research on biological warfare conducted by Nazi scientists would not be continued, and many of the facilities associated with these programs were dismantled or repurposed for peaceful use. Yet, the very knowledge that had been developed in these laboratories could not be easily erased from history. Much of the information was retained in secret archives, inaccessible to the public, and the technology continued to influence later developments in biological and chemical warfare during the Cold War. Meanwhile, the fate of the laboratories themselves continued to be shaped by political and economic realities. Some were left in ruins, their high-tech facilities destroyed in the post-war scramble to clear away the remnants of war. Others were converted into military bases or research centers under Allied control, but their former purpose was often erased or hidden beneath layers of bureaucracy. In some cases, the scale of the destruction was so great that there was little to salvage beyond the remains of the buildings and the abandoned equipment.